If you were to fall asleep tonight and drift backwards in time, you would find yourself in a world without cars, without glowing screens, without even the distant hum of electricity. Instead, the night would be dark, truly dark, lit only by the faint shimmer of the stars and the flickering glow of fire. You would wake to the sound of church bells marking the hours, to the low murmur of cattle in their stalls, to the chatter of villagers moving about their daily business. The village itself would be small, perhaps no more than a cluster of wooden cottages huddled together along a muddy lane, their walls patched with wattle and daub, their roofs thatched with straw. Chickens would scurry underfoot, dogs would bark from doorways, and the air would carry the mixed scent of smoke, manure, and freshly baked bread. But cutting through these ordinary sounds, louder than the murmur of voices and sharper than the calls of birds, there would be one noise that never failed to announce itself: the steady, ringing strike of a hammer against iron. Clang, clang, clang. A sound as familiar to the villagers as the tolling of the bells or the cries of the cockerel at dawn. That sound came from the forge, and it belonged to the blacksmith. From a distance, the blacksmith might have seemed a figure of great respect, almost importance. After all, everyone relied on him. He was the man who shaped the very bones of the village's survival. The farmer could not till his field without a plough, and who made the plough? The blacksmith. The shepherd could not shear his sheep without shears, and who crafted them? The blacksmith. The carpenter could not build his furniture without nails, the soldier could not ride without stirrups, the knight could not fight without his sword, and the horse could not travel without shoes nailed to its hooves. In a world where nearly everything was made of wood or iron, the blacksmith's hand touched almost every object that mattered. Without him, the village would falter. Yet this importance did not mean his life was easy. Quite the opposite. It meant his life was harder, heavier, hotter, and far more exhausting than most of his neighbors could even imagine. Step into the smithy, if only in your imagination. The building is plain, perhaps built of stone with a low roof, its walls stained black from years of smoke. Inside, it is dim except for the fierce glow of the forge fire. The flames lick upward, orange and red, consuming the charcoal that the bellows feed with a steady rush of air. The heat radiates outward in suffocating waves. Even on the coldest winter morning, when frost hangs in the air and villagers stamp their feet to keep warm, stepping into the smithy feels like stepping into summer. The air is thick, shimmering with warmth, heavy with the smell of ash and iron. There is no breeze, no window to let in fresh air, only the constant smothering fire. And the blacksmith cannot escape it. From dawn until dusk, he stands before that furnace, sweat dripping from his brow, soaking his tunic, stinging his eyes. His arms ache as he lifts his hammer again and again, striking metal that glows white with heat. Each blow sends sparks flying in every direction, little bursts of fire that hiss when they strike the floor, or worse, burn holes in his clothing, land on his bare skin, or sting his eyes. The work is relentless, and it is dangerous. The noise of the smithy is another kind of torment. For those passing outside, it might seem almost reassuring, a sign that life goes on, that tools are being made, that work is being done. But for the blacksmith himself, it is a constant roar. The hammer crashes against the iron, the anvil rings like a bell, the fire hisses, and the bellows wheeze. All day, every day, this noise fills his ears until there is no quiet left. In the evening, when he finally lays down to rest, the echo of the hammer still rings in his head. It is possible that many blacksmiths went half-deaf long before their hair turned grey, their ears dulled by years of endless clanging. There was no relief, no peace, only the memory of sound, following them even into their dreams. And then there were the dangers that came not from noise or heat, but from the very nature of the work itself. Hot iron is a temperamental thing. Strike it at the wrong angle, and a shard might fly off like a tiny spear. Strike it too soon, and it may crack. Strike it too late, and it may harden into something useless. Every moment carried risk. Without gloves, without goggles, without any protection but instinct and experience, the blacksmith faced fire and metal with nothing between his flesh and the danger. Burns were common. Scars were common. Fingers were sometimes lost, eyes sometimes blinded, and lungs often filled with soot from the fire. The forge did not forgive mistakes, and yet mistakes were easy to make when your body was already weary, your hands already shaking from the long hours of toil. Despite this, there was no shortage of work. In fact, there was too much. The village always needed something. A farmer might come knocking at dawn, desperate for a new blade to cut his wheat. A traveler might arrive at midday, needing his horse shod before he could continue. A nobleman might send word that his soldiers required new weapons, and those weapons needed to be ready not next week, but tomorrow. The blacksmith was pulled in every direction, his hands never idle, his hammer never still. He worked while others rested. He worked while others feasted. His reward was modest coin, sometimes food, sometimes favor, but never wealth. He was respected, yes, because without him, no one could live comfortably. But respect does not feed a man when he is too tired to eat, nor heal his burns, nor quiet the ringing in his ears. Respect did not make him rich. It simply meant that he was too important to ignore, but not important enough to celebrate. And when war came, as it so often did, the burden grew heavier still. The fields might be quiet, but the smithy roared with fire. Soldiers demanded arrowheads, thousands of them, hammered out in long rows. Knights demanded swords and armor. Their lords demanded shields and spears. All of it had to be forged quickly. All of it had to be strong. The blacksmith's hammer fell faster, harder, longer into the night, his arms trembling with exhaustion. The soldiers would march away to glory, to songs, to tales told in taverns and castles. But when they returned victorious, no one sang for the blacksmith who had made their weapons. His name was not remembered in ballads. His face did not appear in tapestries. He remained in the background, sweating in the heat, coughing in the smoke, burning his hands for the sake of those who would never thank him. And so, if you look closely at this man, this blacksmith, you see the truth of his life. He is weary, his shoulders rounded from years of lifting, his hands scarred and cracked, his lungs heavy from smoke, his hearing dulled from endless noise. He is not a knight in shining armor, nor a lord in a fine hall, nor even a farmer breathing the fresh air of the fields. He is a man bound to fire and iron, a man who labors in heat while others shiver, who labors in noise while others rest in silence. His importance is undeniable, and yet his suffering is equally undeniable. That is why, for all its respect, for all its necessity, it truly sucked to be a medieval blacksmith. And now, as the fire in your imagination begins to die down, as the hammering fades, and as the sparks flicker out one by one, you can let the sound settle into quiet. The village grows calm, the chickens roost, the dogs sleep, the tavern doors close, and the only light left is the faint glow of embers in the forge. The blacksmith finally sets down his hammer. He wipes the sweat from his brow. He sinks onto a bench, tired beyond words. Tomorrow, he will rise again before dawn, and the sound of hammer against iron will echo once more. But for tonight at least, the forge grows quiet, and so too may you. If you drift further back into the quiet corners of the medieval world, past the forge with its noise and sparks, past the market stalls with their chatter and smells, past the manor house where the lord and lady live in comfort, you will eventually find yourself in the simple, weather-worn cottages of the peasants. These were the people who made up the majority of medieval society, the ordinary men and women who worked the land, tended the animals, and kept the entire feudal system alive with their endless labor. And while stories may sometimes soften their lives into a kind of quaint, rustic simplicity, the truth is far less charming. Life as a peasant was hard, heavy, dirty, and endlessly repetitive. To be a medieval peasant was to wake each morning with aching limbs, to face work that never truly ended, and to live with the knowledge that you were always at the mercy of weather, disease, and lords who owned more of your life than you did yourself. The peasant's day began with the first light of dawn, long before the sun had truly warmed the earth. There were no soft beds to rise from, only a straw mattress on the floor, shared with family members, sometimes with animals in the same room for warmth. The roof above might leak when it rained, the walls might creak in the wind, and the air inside was heavy with smoke from the cooking fire, which often had no chimney to draw it away. Imagine waking with sore muscles from yesterday's labor, stretching your arms in a room that smelled of damp straw and wood smoke, pulling on the same rough woolen clothing you wore yesterday and the day before, and the day before that. For peasants owned little, and what they owned was worn until it fell apart. The first task of the morning was to tend to the animals, if the family was lucky enough to have them. Chickens needed feeding, cows needed milking, pigs needed slop. Then came the real work, the fields. For nearly every peasant, the rhythm of life followed the rhythm of the soil. Ploughing, planting, weeding, harvesting. This was the cycle that never ended. Spring meant long days bent over the ground, planting seed by hand. Summer meant hours of sweating under the sun, pulling weeds and repairing fences. Autumn meant harvest, cutting stalks with a sickle until your back felt like it would break. Winter meant mending tools, patching roofs, and waiting anxiously to see if the food stores would last until spring. Every season brought new work, and there was no season of rest. Unlike the nobility, who held feasts, or the clergy, who copied manuscripts, the peasant's life was bound tightly to the soil, a chain that could not be broken. And the work was not only endless, but also brutally hard on the body. Imagine hours of laboring with a wooden plow pulled by a tired ox, the earth resisting with every step. Imagine cutting grain with a sickle, your back bent, your hands blistering, your muscles trembling with exhaustion long before the day was over. Imagine carrying heavy bundles of hay, fetching water from the well in buckets that cut into your hands, kneeling in the dirt to repair a fence with nothing but simple tools. This was not work that came and went. This was work that consumed every waking hour. By the time the sun set, a peasant's body was so weary that sleep came easily, but the rest was never enough. The next day would be the same, and the day after that, and the day after that. As if the sheer labor was not enough, peasants also carried the constant weight of obligation. They did not own the land they worked. The fields belonged to the local lord, and the peasants worked them in exchange for protection. Protection that often felt distant and uncertain. Every harvest meant giving up a share of the crop to the lord as rent. Every year brought taxes, tithes to the church, and countless small dues. A portion of their labor, a portion of their food, a portion of their animals, all went to someone else. Even when they had worked themselves nearly to exhaustion, even when the harvest was poor, even when their families were hungry, they were still expected to pay. Falling short could mean punishment, or worse, the slow hunger of a winter with too little grain stored away. And then, hovering always at the edges of life, were the dangers that peasants had no power to escape. Disease was a constant threat. A simple cough could turn deadly. An infection from a small cut could fester without medicine. Epidemics swept through villages without warning, carrying away children, parents, neighbors, sometimes half the community in a single season. Famine, too, was a frequent visitor. If the harvest failed because of poor weather, or because war trampled the fields, or because pests destroyed the grain, then hunger followed. Bread grew thin, bellies shrank, and survival became uncertain. And war itself was perhaps the cruelest danger of all. Peasants had no armies, no armor, no defenses. When soldiers passed through, they could seize food, burn homes, and take what little the peasants possessed. A peasant's life was fragile, and it could be overturned in a single day by forces far beyond their control. Even in the best of times, the daily existence of a peasant was one of repetition and limitation. Their food was plain: bread, porridge, onions, perhaps a little cheese or ale if fortune allowed. Meat was rare, often reserved for feasts or stolen in desperate times. Their clothing was simple, coarse wool or linen, patched again and again until it barely held together. Their homes were dark, smoky, crowded, with floors of dirt and little privacy. Entertainment was rare, education rarer still. Few peasants could read, fewer still could write. Their lives were lived close to the earth, measured not in years of luxury, but in cycles of sowing and harvest, hunger and survival. And yet, for all its hardship, peasant life carried on, century after century. They laughed when they could, sang songs in the fields, told stories by the fire at night, celebrated weddings and births with joy despite the hardships that surrounded them. They endured, not because life was easy, but because there was no choice. The weight of survival pressed on their shoulders, and they bore it, generation after generation, until their names were forgotten and only the memory of their labor remained. So, when you imagine the medieval world, do not picture only the castles and knights, the lords and ladies. Picture also the countless peasants, rising before dawn, walking barefoot across the fields, bending their backs to the soil, their hands raw, their bodies weary, their lives bound to labor that never ended. For though their existence may seem distant now, it was their toil that fed the world, their sweat that kept the system alive. And yet, for all their importance, their lives were often short, often thankless, and often marked more by struggle than by joy. That is why, for all the simplicity some might imagine, it truly sucked to be a medieval peasant. And now, as you drift deeper into rest, you may imagine the fields at dusk. The sun sinks behind the trees, the last sheaves of grain are tied and carried home. The animals settle in their pens, and the villagers return to their cottages, their tired faces lit by the faint glow of the hearth fire. Tomorrow will bring the same work, the same burdens, the same cycle. But for tonight, the fields are quiet, the tools are set aside, and even the peasants may rest. And so too, may you. When people think of the medieval world, they often imagine the knight first, the armored figure on horseback, a shining sword at his side, banners fluttering in the wind, admired by peasants and praised in songs. Knights are remembered as the heroes of chivalry, the champions of lords and kings, the very symbol of the Middle Ages. But as with so many things in history, the truth is far less glamorous than the stories. Behind the polished image was a life of hardship, danger, and endless duty. To be a knight was not just to ride into glory, it was also to sweat, to bleed, to suffer under heavy armor, and to live constantly at the edge of violence and death. From the very beginning, the path of the knight was harsh. Training began in childhood, often as early as 7 years old, when a boy was sent away from his family to serve as a page in another noble's household. There, his days were filled with menial tasks: cleaning, carrying messages, serving meals, learning manners, and slowly, learning the basics of horsemanship and weaponry. At 14, if he was strong and capable, he might be promoted to squire, a position that demanded even more labor. A squire was responsible for the care of his master's armor and weapons, which were far from light or simple, polishing chainmail, sharpening swords, repairing dents in helmets. These were endless tasks, and all the while, the young squire trained with wooden weapons, mounted horses again and again, and practiced until his arms ached and his body trembled from exhaustion. Only after years of this work would he perhaps be dubbed a knight. By the time the ceremony arrived, the young man had already endured a decade of discipline and bruises. But even when the title was won, the burden only grew heavier. Armor itself was a trial. A full suit of mail or plate weighed anywhere from 40 to 60 pounds, sometimes more. and though a well-trained knight could move in it, the weight pressed constantly on the body. Imagine riding in the summer sun, sweat pooling beneath layers of metal, the air inside your helmet stifling and hot. Imagine marching across muddy fields with that weight dragging at your shoulders, every step sinking deeper into exhaustion. And then, when battle came, the knight had to fight in that same armor, swinging a heavy sword or lance, all while trying to stay alive amid chaos. It was not glorious. It was brutal. Wounds were constant companions. A knight's life was one of violence. On the battlefield, in tournaments, even on the road, where bandits and rival lords were never far away. Blows from axes split shields, arrows pierced through gaps in mail, lances knocked men from horses with bone-shattering force. Even if a knight survived battle, he often carried scars that lasted a lifetime. Broken bones, infected cuts, and concussions were common. Medical care was primitive at best, and infection was a danger as real as the sword itself. A knight might spend weeks recovering from a wound, only to be called to fight again as soon as he could stand. Knights bore heavy costs. They had to maintain horses, armor, and weapons, often sinking into debt just to fulfill their duties. War meant riding out whether ready or not, and peace only brought more disputes and small campaigns that drained them further. Even chivalry, the supposed honor of knighthood, was more burden than blessing. Knights were expected to be loyal, brave, and noble, yet the reality was often brutal. Villages burned, peasants suffered, and ideals crumbled under survival. So while stories show shining armor, the truth was sweat, scars, and exhaustion. Beneath the ceremony lay a life of hardship and duty wrapped in iron. And as night falls, you might picture a weary knight, armor dented, body aching, finally setting aside his sword. Tomorrow he will ride again.